In this video, we will be examining both Egyptian and Indian pottery production.
So this is an experimental archaeology recreation of pre-dynastic Egyptian pottery. They would source their raw clay from the ground, which they would then wet, dry, and then sieve for impurities. Then they would wet it and use it. For temper, they use leftover wheat. For tools, they mainly use their hands, but also use wooden tools for shaping the clay. The pottery was usually made on the ground in large pottery shops by women. It was important the clay stayed wet, so they placed a wet piece of linen on the clay that they weren't using. To form the pots, they used a coil and pinch method, which starts off with a flat round base, which they will then begin to add coils around. These coils can be made and added, but in a variety of ways depending on the potter. While adding the coils, they make sure to compress the coils to the layer beneath it. After adding a few coils, he will then scrape off the extra clay from the edge to make a smoother outside surface. Once he gets to a certain point in the pot, he will then use a paddle and anvil method with a wooden paddle to compress the walls and sculpt the pot. He then makes a handle by scoring where he wants on the pot for the handle to be, and making a handle from a coil. And then he uses slip as an adhesive to attach the handle. And then he allows it to dry for a certain amount of time until it changes color. At this point, it's very fragile, so he carefully smooths the surface and then uses red iron oxide wash to decorate the pot, which is applied by a wooden brush that's made of either human or animal hair. He will then allow the pot to dry for several weeks until it is dry enough to be fired. Once it's fired, it will look like this. These pots were usually used for storing grains and liquids.
In Tamil Nadu, India, the clay comes from large clumps gathered from the local riverbank. Clumps are transported to a workshop where they are aged for up to a year or until they have the right consistency. From there, the clay is broken into smaller pieces and laid in the sun to dry. These pieces are then taken to another workshop and are loaded into a spinning metal drum. Water is added into the drum to create a smooth water and clay mixture. This mixture is sifted using mesh shells to remove any rocks and impurities before being left in the sun to dry. This process creates a soft clay, which is passed through rollers multiple times. The rollers give the clay the smooth consistency needed to begin pot making. While Egyptian pottery is manually made, the pots made in Tamil Nadu are made with the help of machinery. Women prepare the pots by using a jigger and jolly machine. This machine uses the spinning wheel method rather than manually adding coils. It shapes and trims the pot while the clay is added into a mold. The force of the spinning pushes the clay along the sides and creates the pot-like shape. The clay dries for 10 to 15 minutes before shrinking, allowing the pot to pop out of the mold. The pot is then trimmed and smoothed with moist hands. Once the pots are smooth, they're sent to specialists in other workshops who add curry pot handles, which is a common trend in Indian cooking pots. Once complete, the pots are set in an updraft kiln, a heating pit where the heat rises from bottom to top. This process is time-consuming and often requires the work of multiple people. They have to ensure that each pot is in a good position so it can be thoroughly heated. The straw and mud is used to cover the top of the kiln in order to keep the heat inside. Firing lasts about 3 to 4 hours and must be constantly fueled by firewood, meaning that heating the kiln requires a lot of attention. While women help prepare the kiln, the heating process is normally done by men, as the work is tedious and requires a lot of physical endurance. Once cooled, the pots are packed and shipped off, where they are used for cooking and food storage.
The information that we have learned from these two videos is crucial to understanding artifacts from the archaeological record. If they are very uniform in design, the pots will have been made in a style similar to the Indian potters, using molds and industrial equipment to shape and create their pots. Whereas if the pots are not as uniform and have individual styles like the Egyptian pots, they are handmade ceramics and utilize a more primitive style. These non-uniform pots are indicative of individual potters instead of machine-based pottery. In this graph, we determined how many times clay was added to the pot during the production of the ceramics. It's clear that Egyptian potters were continuously adding new clay to their creations, while the Indian method relies on a single addition of clay, while the excess is removed by hand and with specialized tools. So we can assume that pots made with the coil method utilize many additions of clay and is a much more time-consuming process compared to pots made with the molds and the jigger and jolly process. In the Egyptian video, one single potter was responsible for collecting the material, modeling it, and firing it, while in the Indian pottery video, there are many people involved in the process of gathering, molding, and firing the pots. There is also a division of labor in the Indian video because men and women do different work during the process. Women are responsible for molding the clay, while men procure the clay from the river and fire the freshly made pots in a kiln, which could lead us to believe that similar pots in the archaeological record may follow a comparable pattern, where men do the more arduous and laborious tasks, while women do the shaping and molding of the pots. From looking at these two different processes, we can gather that pottery making is a very diverse skill which involves many different styles and techniques. Now that we know two different pottery methods, we will have a better understanding of similar pots in the archaeological record. We can even make assumptions about dissimilar pots, because if they look different from the pots we just examined, we can rule out certain processes. We can even look beyond the methods behind the creation of these pots and examine the material culture that created them. We can make inferences about societies based on their pottery culture and determine how labor was used, how resources were gathered, and how food was stored and distributed. It is amazing how much we can discover by performing ethno-archaeological surveys and experimental archaeology.